In a war defined by distance, data, and detection, survival is no longer about how fast you fly, but how long you stay unseen and connected. That is the uncomfortable question now facing Australia's F divided by a -18F Super Hornet, a jet that has served reliably for over a decade, but is now operating in a radically different Indo-Pacific battlespace. On paper, the Royal Australian Air Force still fields 24 Super Hornets, fully operational, combat-proven, and recently enhanced with long-range strike capability through the integration of the AGM-158C long-range anti-ship missile, declared ready for operational use in 2025. At the same time, Canberra has committed to a sustainment and upgrade pathway supported by the United States, including advanced electronic warfare systems, next-generation electronic attack units, and tactical targeting network technology under a package valued at around $2 billion Australian dollars. Yet here lies the contradiction. While Australia is investing heavily to keep the Super Hornet relevant, it is also accelerating the shift toward fifth-generation aircraft, autonomous systems like the MQ-28 Ghost Bat, and a fully integrated command and control architecture under programs such as AIR6500. This is not a simple upgrade cycle. It is a transition between two eras of warfare. In previous operations, including deployments over the Middle East, the Super Hornet operated in environments where Australia and its partners controlled the airspace, supported by secure bases and stable logistics. Today, that assumption no longer holds. The Indo-Pacific is now characterized by vast distances, contested airspace, advanced sensor networks, and long-range strike systems capable of reaching well beyond traditional front lines. Northern Australian bases are being hardened, fuel and munition stockpiles are being expanded, and defense planning is increasingly focused on denial strategy rather than forward dominance. In that context, the central question becomes unavoidable. If a high-intensity conflict were to emerge in the Indo-Pacific tomorrow, would the Super Hornet still survive long enough to be effective, or has the nature of modern warfare already outpaced the aircraft it was designed to be? To understand the pressure now placed on that aircraft, the focus has to shift from the jet itself to the environment it must operate in, because the Indo-Pacific is no longer defined by isolated engagements but by distance, detection, and disruption occurring at the same time across thousands of kilometers. Australia is no longer preparing for short-range operations close to well-protected bases. It is preparing for a scenario where aircraft may need to operate far from home, supported by tankers, data links, and forward locations that could themselves be under constant surveillance. This is why recent defense planning has emphasized a strategy of denial, not dominance, meaning the objective is to prevent any adversary from operating freely across key maritime approaches rather than simply overpowering them in direct confrontation. In practical terms, that shift changes everything for a platform like the Super Hornet. The distances from northern Australia to critical sea lanes or contested zones can stretch well beyond 1,000 kilometers, which means the aircraft must rely heavily on KC-30 Alpha tanker support to remain effective. At the same time, advances in long-range sensing technologies, including over-the-horizon radar, space-based surveillance, and integrated air defense systems, mean that aircraft are more likely to be detected earlier than ever before. Detection leads to tracking, and tracking creates the conditions for long-range engagement, often before a pilot is even aware they have been targeted. This is compounded by the growing presence of layered defense networks that combine radar, electronic warfare, and surface-to-air missile systems into a single coordinated shield. In this kind of battle space, survivability is no longer just about speed or maneuver. It is about whether an aircraft can avoid being seen, or at least avoid being targeted long enough to complete its mission. At the same time, the threat is not limited to the air. Modern conflict planning now assumes that airbases, fuel supplies, and communication networks may all be disrupted, which directly affects sortie rates and response times. Australia has already begun reinforcing northern bases and expanding logistics resilience for this exact reason, recognizing that the fight for control of the air may begin long before any aircraft takes off. Within this expanding and increasingly contested environment, the Super Hornet is no longer operating in a controlled system. It is operating inside a network that can be challenged at every layer, and that is where the real test begins. Inside that contested environment, the Super Hornet reveals both why it still matters and why its limits are becoming more visible, because on its own it remains a highly capable multi-role fighter, but it was never designed to fight alone against a fully networked threat. The aircraft can reach speeds of around Mach 1.6, carry a broad mix of air-to-air and precision strike weapons, and operate with a combat radius that can be extended significantly through aerial refueling. More importantly, recent integration of the long-range anti-ship missile has transformed its role, allowing it to strike maritime targets from standoff distances well beyond traditional engagement ranges, which is highly relevant in a region defined by sea control and denial. At the same time, upgrades aligned with the United States Block 3 standard have improved data processing, cockpit awareness, and network connectivity, enabling the aircraft to share targeting data across a wider battle space rather than relying solely on its own sensors. But these strengths come with a condition, because the aircraft depends heavily on the system around it. Without tanker support, its reach across the Indo-Pacific is limited. Without airborne early warning and control from platforms such as the E-7 Alpha Wedgetail, its situational awareness is reduced. Without electronic protection from the A-18G Growler, which is now being enhanced with next-generation jamming capabilities, its exposure to advanced detection systems increases. In other words, the Super Hornet is no longer defined by what it can do independently, but by how effectively it can plug into a wider combat network. This becomes critical when considering survivability, because the aircraft does not have the low observable characteristics of fifth-generation platforms, meaning it is more likely to be detected earlier in a high-threat environment. That does not make it obsolete, but it changes how it must be used. Instead of leading deep penetration missions, it is increasingly positioned as a standoff strike platform, a force multiplier within a coordinated package, or a flexible response asset that can operate across multiple mission types when supported correctly. This shift in role is not theoretical. It is already reflected in how Australia is investing in sustainment, electronic warfare integration, and long-range weapons, all of which point to a clear reality. The Super Hornet remains lethal, but only when it is part of something larger than itself. What emerges from this reality is a very different picture of air combat, one where no single aircraft dominates the fight, but where survival depends on how well each element connects into a wider system that can sense, decide, and act faster than anything opposing it. In Australia's case, that system is already taking shape across multiple layers. The E-7 Alpha Wedgetail provides airborne early warning and battle management, effectively acting as the central coordinator that tracks targets and directs aircraft in real time across vast distances. The MQ-4C Triton extends surveillance far beyond the horizon, monitoring maritime approaches with persistence that no crewed aircraft can sustain. The MC-55 Alpha Peregrine, recently introduced into service, adds another layer by collecting electronic intelligence and identifying threats before they fully emerge. Supporting all of this is the KC-30 Alpha tanker fleet, which allows fighters like the Super Hornet to operate far beyond their natural range, maintaining presence in areas that would otherwise be unreachable. At the same time, the EA-18G Growler plays a critical role in protecting the entire formation, using advanced electronic warfare systems, including the next-generation jammer, to disrupt detection and targeting systems that would otherwise compromise the mission. All of these elements are increasingly being tied together under a broader command and control architecture, often referred to as an integrated battle management system, designed to fuse sensor data and distribute it across the force in near real time. This is where the transformation becomes most visible, because the Super Hornet is no longer just a platform delivering weapons. It becomes one node within a distributed network where information is as decisive as firepower. Looking ahead, this network is expected to expand further with the introduction of autonomous systems such as the MQ-28 Ghost Bat, which has already completed numerous test flights and is being developed to operate alongside crewed aircraft as a force multiplier. The concept is straightforward but powerful, pairing each crewed platform with multiple uncrewed systems to extend sensing, increase survivability, and complicate any attempt to track or target the force. In this evolving structure, the effectiveness of the Super Hornet is no longer measured by its individual performance, but by how seamlessly it integrates into a layered, resilient system designed to operate even when parts of that system are under pressure. And that raises the next critical question: what happens when that system is no longer functioning as intended? The real test begins when that carefully built system is placed under pressure, because modern conflict planning no longer assumes that every layer will function perfectly from start to finish. Instead, it assumes disruption, delay, and degradation across multiple domains at the same time. If tanker support is reduced or forced to operate further away due to risk, the effective reach of the Super Hornet shrinks immediately, limiting how far it can project power from northern bases. If data links are degraded or contested, the flow of targeting information slows down, forcing pilots to rely more on onboard sensors, which reduces the advantage of a distributed network. If airborne early warning coverage is interrupted, situational awareness becomes fragmented, increasing uncertainty in an already complex battle space. These are not theoretical concerns, they are the exact vulnerabilities that current Australian defense planning is trying to address through investment in resilient basing, hardened infrastructure, and expanded logistics capacity across the north. The assumption is clear: future operations will not occur from a position of complete control. They will occur in an environment where every sortie depends on a chain of support that can be challenged at any point. For the Super Hornet, this creates a critical dependency profile. Its strength as a multi-role platform becomes less relevant if it cannot reach the area of operations with sufficient fuel, receive updated targeting data in real time, or operate under the protective umbrella of electronic warfare support. In a degraded scenario, the aircraft is still capable, but the margin for error becomes significantly smaller. This is why recent investment decisions have focused not only on platforms, but on the entire system that sustains them, including stockpiles of long-range munitions, improved base resilience, and the ability to disperse operations across multiple locations rather than relying on a few fixed sites. The goal is not to eliminate risk, but to ensure that even when parts of the system are disrupted, enough capability remains intact to continue operating effectively. Within this framework, the Super Hornet is no longer evaluated in isolation. It is assessed based on how well it performs when the system around it is stressed, and that is where the true question of survivability is answered, not in ideal conditions, but in the moments when everything begins to break down. What this ultimately reveals is not the decline of a single aircraft, but the transition of an entire force, because the Super Hornet is now operating at the intersection between what Australia has relied on for the past decade and what it is preparing to become in the next. In the near term, the aircraft remains highly relevant, particularly in roles that leverage its flexibility and newly expanded strike range, including maritime operations supported by long-range anti-ship missiles and coalition missions where interoperability with United States forces remains a decisive advantage. The continued investment in sustainment, electronic warfare integration, and network connectivity shows that Australia is not stepping away from the platform. It is extracting as much operational value as possible while the next generation of capabilities matures. But the long-term trajectory is increasingly clear. The introduction of fifth-generation aircraft such as the F-35 Alpha, the development of autonomous systems like the MQ-28 Ghost Bat, and the expansion of integrated command and control through programs such as AIR6500 are all reshaping how air power is applied across the Indo-Pacific. In that future structure, the Super Hornet does not disappear, but its role evolves, shifting away from leading high-risk penetration missions and toward acting as a versatile strike and support platform within a distributed and resilient network. This is not a sign of weakness. It is a recognition that modern warfare rewards systems that can adapt, connect, and persist under pressure rather than platforms that operate alone. For Australia, the real strategic question is not how long the Super Hornet can continue flying, because with ongoing upgrades and service life extensions it can remain operational well into the next decade, but whether the broader transition to a more integrated, networked force can be completed in time. Defense planning already points to increased investment in long-range strike, hardened northern infrastructure, and higher overall spending targets approaching 3% of national output by the early 2030s, all of which reflect an urgency to move faster. In that context, the Super Hornet becomes something more than just an aircraft. It becomes a bridge, one that carries Australia from a familiar model of air combat into a far more complex and contested future, and the success of that transition will determine not only how long the aircraft remains effective, but how prepared the nation is for the kind of conflict that may define the region in the years ahead.